Hello, my name's John. This is my go-to for simple bases, and you're watching Wargames, Models, and Other Hobbies. Hello, and welcome to the video. Today I'm going to be looking at my go-to base painting for most of my models. I use this technique to create more of a kind of a base palette to then add extra detail and that kind of thing to bases, but it's perfectly good on its own. So sometimes when I get to a stage with a model, I'll paint the base up in this style and then I can think about adding more details, more colours and things later on. So there's only 4 elements to the bases that I use as a kind of a go-to, and that is 2 of the texture or technical paints, the Agrellan Earth and Nastra Granite. Then have Agrax Earth Shade as a wash, and then dry brushing over the top with Grey Sear or a similar paint. So I've got all of the stages here in front. If we have a look at what the first stage is going to end up looking like, we have here the Agrellan Earth, which is a kind of a broken mud, dried up mud kind of texture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply that first to this Dark Angel miniature, and I apply this particular one with the texture applicator. Because it's only a small base, I'm going to use the small end, but all I do is scoop some out of the pot, and then I just move that onto the base itself. I've spilt some over the edge, so let me clean that up. And I put it in a few places on that base. Now, you can do it thickly, you can do it thinly, entirely up to you. It depends what you want to get out of the texture at the end of it. I wash that texture tool exactly the same way as I wash my brushes, as well, in a pot of water. Now I have 1 or 2 options now. I can leave this to dry naturally. Alternatively, something that I often do is force it with a hairdryer. So I have a hairdryer here, and what I'm going to do, I'm just going to hairdry. Let's move these out of the way to focus. I'm going to hairdryer this so you can watch it cracking. So as you can see, it's starting to crack around the edges. So it does this naturally anyway, but using a hairdryer does force it to do it quite quickly. So what I've now got, if I can get this in focus, we've got the cracked surface of this paint. If you leave it for just a long enough period to dry anyway, it will do this cracking anyway. But I do like to force it sometimes. But it still needs to dry at this point. It's not fully dry. Please be careful when you're using a hairdryer as well. It can get quite hot and it can distort the minis. You can also risk burning yourself, so always be careful. So the next stage, once I've got that dried on the base, I use some of the Astra Granite. There are a few other ones that I use, but this is the more kind of granulated texture is the thing that I go for with these ones. And rather than using the texture tool, I actually just paint this on with a big brush. You've got to make sure you clean the brush properly afterwards as well, though. But let's just paint this texture on exactly where I want it to be. Now with the more granulated texture paints, really important to let it dry thoroughly before you do any other kind of parts to it. I found from my experience I can never get it to dry in the forced manner with a hairdryer to a nice quality, so I tend to always leave it to dry naturally. You might have better luck than me, but I found it becomes a bit too kind of rounded and smooth when I use the hairdryer, so I tend to paint this, then just leave it to dry naturally. You can make these texture paints as well. The granulated ones, you can add a little bit of sand or sawdust to a chosen paint to create that texture, so don't feel you have to use the ones that Games Workshop produce, and there's loads of other ones that are made. But as I've got them, that's why I'm using them. So once I've got to that stage, we end up with a base looking like this. And what I do at this point is I tie both of these colours together, or whichever ones that I've used. And I do that with some Agrax Earthshade. Now you'll hear a little noise as I shake that. I've actually put a ball bearing into this so it mixes up a bit better in the pot. Personal preference, I tend to like using the Games Workshop pots. Other people like using droppers or decanting them into other things. Entirely up to you. But all I'm going to do with the Earthshade is get a generous amount on my brush, and then I'm just going to paint this over the base itself. And at this point, it doesn't matter if I get any of this on the lower sections of the foot or the model. It'll add to a little bit of weathering from the ground itself. But the key thing when you are applying this layer is the previous ones have to be dry. So you might need a little bit of patience. If they're not dry, what tends to happen is you start to move that colour around on the base, and it can kind of ruin the base a little bit, and you might have to redo certain parts. But once that's on in place, we just want to set that back to dry. And then once it's dry, it'll have that even shade across the whole thing. The next step is some dry brushing. I'm going to use some grey cere, but you can use pretty much any colour that you want for this. I have in the past used a green to get a more grass-like texture or a moss-like texture, but I'm just going to use the grey cere because I want a kind of an ashy kind of wasteland kind of look on this one. And as I dry brush this on, I try to be careful not to get it on the feet, but if it does go on the feet, similar to the wash, doesn't matter because it just adds that little bit of weathering to the model itself, so it looks like it's kicked up a bit of dust and so on. This dry brush is getting a little bit worse for wear. I should take better care of my brushes. So at that point, you can see we've dry brushed over the whole top of the surface. Let's look at the sergeant of the squad so you can see that base there. Now at this point, the final thing I do whenever I paint my miniatures, or when I've finished doing the bases, is I'll repaint the rim of the base itself. I like to go for a black rim around the edge. Whatever colour suits you, doesn't really matter. But what I can do at this point is then either do some more ink washes and some more dry brushes and so on to kind of make more depth and so on. But this is my go-to base to start with this process. If you've got any questions or anything, please drop a comment. But for now, my name's John, and you've been watching War Games, Models and Other Hobbies.